We're now going to turn our attention to a category of financial measures that's referred to as financial efficiency, or sometimes simply referred to as the efficiency ratios. We're going to cover 5 different efficiency ratios, and in this video we're going to cover the bottom 4 of those. In other words, we're going to cover these that are in the yellow and blue background, and then we'll use a separate video to cover something called the asset turnover ratio. The operating expense ratio, the depreciation expense ratio, and the interest expense ratio are a lot of times referred to as simply as the expense ratios. Some publications even take the net farm income from operations ratio and include it in what's referred to as the expense ratios. It's a really simple concept because these 4 ratios, these 4 that are at the bottom, simply take the business's total revenue and determine what percent of that revenue is operating expenses, what percent is depreciation, and what percent is interest, and then what percent is net farm income. Now you know net farm income is simply total revenue minus operating expenses, which includes depreciation, and minus interest. So using common sense, these 4 ratios have to add to 1. So when we get those calculated, we can come right here and simply add those, and they must add to 100% if we've done this correctly. Okay. Now remember, depreciation is a part of operating expenses. So to calculate this operating expense ratio, what we have to do is simply go find operating expenses and subtract depreciation. So what happens is this operating expense ratio is equal to operating expenses minus depreciation divided by total revenue. Because we're going to treat depreciation as a separate category, and because it is an operating expense, if we left it in that operating expense and then calculated it separately, we'd account for it twice. Now be careful here when you set up the formulas. Let me show you what to do. You go equals, and then I'm going to open parentheses, and do that before I go find the information. Now, the operating expenses and depreciation are on the income statement. So once you've typed equal and open parentheses, go to the income statement, find total operating expenses, subtract depreciation, close parentheses, and then divide by total revenue. And when you hit enter, you'll find that 58.81% of this farm's revenue was operating expenses. Now the remaining 3 are really easy. For depreciation expense, the depreciation expense ratio is simply equal to depreciation divided by total revenue. The interest expense ratio is equal to total interest divided by total revenue, and the net farm income from operations is simply equal to net farm income from operations over total revenue. So you see, really what these 4 ratios do is just segment the total farm revenue into the 3 expense categories and the profit. Okay, so to do the depreciation ratio, I'll type equals. Now I'll go to the income statement. I'll find depreciation and divide it by total revenue. Hit enter. Then for the interest expense ratio, I'll go equals and go to the income statement. Find total interest, which is right here. Divide that number by total revenue. And then I'll go to net farm income ratio. I'll go equals. Go to the income statement. Go to net farm income from operations and simply divide it by total revenue. Okay. If I have done this correctly, if I'll sum those, and I'll go up and auto sum those, you see they add to 100%. So all the expense ratios really amounts to is taking the farm revenue, the farm business revenue, and dividing it into these 4 different categories. The only thing that's sometimes a little confusing is the operating expense ratio does not include depreciation, even though depreciation is an operating expense. So the operating expense ratio, you can't just divide operating expenses by total revenue. You must subtract the depreciation, because if you didn't do that, you'd actually count the depreciation twice when you did the depreciation expense ratio. When you're doing this on your own now, be sure and sum those ratios at the bottom. Now, don't include the asset turnover. That's a completely different financial measure. But for those four ratios, be sure and sum them. And if you get something over 100%, more than likely what you have done is forgot to subtract depreciation from that operating expense ratio.